ready for this? Today we're diving into the story of a ship with a name that might just catch you off guard. The Jesus of Lübeck.
A ship named Jesus. Now that's intriguing.
Right. And before we get lost at sea, if this is your first time joining us for a deep dive, welcome aboard.
Glad to have you.
Basically, you'll throw us some fascinating sources, articles, research, anything that sparks your curiosity, and we
plunge headfirst into that sea of information and fish out the most interesting and important bits just for you.
Exactly. It's like a custom-made knowledge treasure hunt. And hey, if you're digging these deep dives, make sure you hit that subscribe button over on YouTube.
And don't forget to ring that little notification bell so you don't miss out on any future dives.
Okay, now back to our mysterious ship, the Jesus of Lübeck. It's not every day you come across a ship named after, Jesus, is it?
It certainly grabs your attention, but this ship story, it goes way beyond just its unusual name.
Oh, I bet. Just from glancing at the sources, I can tell this one's going to be a wild ride.
What's fascinating is how this ship takes us on a journey through different periods of history. You know, from its beginnings in the free city of Lubeck, way back around 1540.
Wow, so we're talking almost 500 years ago.
Exactly. And back then, it was mainly a ceremonial ship, a symbol of Lubeck's power and prestige. Kind of hard to picture it as anything else.
I know, right? It's like trying to imagine a royal carriage being used as a delivery truck.
Yeah, something like that. But hold on tight, because this is where things get interesting. Enter King Henry VIII of England. Ambitious, determined to build up the English Navy.
Oh yeah, Henry VIII, the king with a few wives too many.
That's the one. And he had his eyes on this impressive ship from Lubeck. So around the same time, around 1540, he bought the Jesus of Lübeck, adding it to his growing fleet.
Okay, so at this point, I'm guessing this wasn't just some fancy decoration in the harbor.
You guessed right. The Jesus of Lübeck actually saw some action. During the 1545 French invasion of the Isle of Wight, it was right there in the thick of it.
Wow, a real fighting ship.
Oh, and there's more. This might surprise you, but the Jesus of Lübeck was even part of the attempt to salvage Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose.
Wait a minute, the Mary Rose? That's the one they finally raised from the seabed? What was it, a few decades ago?
You got it. That famous warship that sank during the Battle of the Solent, a huge blow to Henry VIII. They tried to raise it right after it sank, and guess who was involved in that effort?
The Jesus of Lübeck. No way.
Yep, it was part of the team. Just imagine that connection, a ship that was later involved in something so different.
Talk about a plot twist. So we've got a ship with royal ties, a history of battles, already pretty fascinating stuff. But, and I have a feeling this is a big but, things take a bit of a dark turn from here.
Yeah, you could say that. The Jesus of Lübeck goes from royal parades to a much darker chapter when Queen Elizabeth I charters it to a group of merchants in 1563. And this is where the story intersects with the Atlantic slave trade.
And that's where the name John Hawkins pops up in our sources, right? This guy's all over this part of the story.
Exactly. John Hawkins, a privateer, basically a state-sanctioned pirate, and a merchant who was behind several voyages between 1562 and 1568 to West Africa and the West Indies. The Jesus of Lübeck. It was a key player in these expeditions.
So what exactly was Hawkins doing with the Jesus of Lübeck on these voyages?
Well, his focus was capturing Africans and transporting them to the Americas to be sold as slaves. And sadly, the Jesus of Lübeck, despite its name, had a significant part in this horrific trade.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. A ship named Jesus involved in the slave trade. It's just, it's pretty hard to process, you know.
It's definitely a jarring contrast. And one of the most shocking things we found is that the Jesus of Lübeck transported and dropped off something like 300 to 500 Africans as slaves in the Dominican Republic. Just let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. A ship named after Jesus, used for something so awful.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And it forces us to face just how complex history can be.
Yeah, and we're talking about the very beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, right?
That's right. It wasn't the huge organized system it would become later on, but these early voyages, these guys like John Hawkins, they were laying the foundation for centuries of exploitation.
It's hard to imagine how something so terrible could become, a trade route. Like, what were the driving forces behind this? What made something like this even possible?
Well, the demand for labor in the Americas was skyrocketing. European colonies were growing fast, and they needed a workforce to cultivate those cash crops, sugar, tobacco.
Right, those big colonial moneymakers.
Exactly. And at the same time, this economic system, mercantilism, was gaining traction.
Okay, mercantilism. Now, remind me about that again.
Sure. Basically, mercantilism is the idea that a nation's wealth and power come from boosting exports and hoarding precious metals like gold and silver. Colonies were seen as a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods.
So the more colonies a country had, the more they could produce and sell, which meant more wealth for the mother country.
You got it. And that created a powerful incentive to exploit the resources of those colonies, including, tragically, human beings.
And Queen Elizabeth I, she was okay with all this.
Well, she saw the potential for profit, for England to challenge Spain's power in the New World. So she gave these privateers like Hawkins permission to raid Spanish ships and set up trade routes, even if it meant getting involved in the slave trade.
Okay, so it makes sense from a purely economic standpoint, I guess. But morally, did people not see how wrong this was?
It's crucial to remember the historical context here. You see, the concept of race, as we understand it today, it was still developing. European societies had their hierarchies, sure, but this idea of racial superiority used to justify enslaving Africans, that was still taking shape.
So are you saying they didn't even see Africans as fully human?
This dehumanization of Africans, it was a gradual process, often relying on twisted religious arguments or misinterpretations of scripture. Some argued that Africans were descended from Ham, Noah's son who was cursed and therefore destined for servitude. Others just saw them as uncivilized savages.
It's just horrific.
It really is. And this gradual dehumanization, it made it easier for people to ignore the blatant immorality of slavery. It allowed them to justify the unimaginable cruelty inflicted on millions.
It's a scary reminder that even deeply held beliefs can be used to justify terrible, terrible things. And we really have to understand these historical roots if we want to grasp the legacy of slavery, how it impacts the world even today.
Absolutely. This story of the Jesus of Lübeck, a ship named after Jesus used to transport enslaved Africans, it forces us to confront the contradictions between ideals and actions, between faith and exploitation.
It also shows how dangerous it is to judge the past solely by our modern values. We might find what people like John Hawkins did abhorrent, but understanding the context they lived in is important too.
Exactly. It's not about condoning their actions, but about trying to understand the historical forces at play. That way, we can better understand how we got to where we are today.
So how does knowing this specific story, the story of the Jesus of Lübeck, shape our understanding of the slave trade's legacy?
It reminds us that the past isn't some distant, irrelevant chapter. It shapes who we are, the societies we live in, the challenges we face right now.
This isn't just about one ship and a few voyages. This is about a much bigger system of exploitation that had a ripple effect across the globe.
Exactly. And those ripples are still being felt today. The transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on Africa, the Americas, and Europe.
Okay, let's talk about that. What are some of those lasting consequences we see today? We're talking about economic disparities, racial inequalities, the fight for social justice, all stemming from this one system.
Yeah, it's a complex legacy intertwined with so many aspects of our world. You look at economic disparities, for instance. The forced removal of millions of Africans ripped apart economies and social structures. It created a system of wealth extraction that benefited European powers, but left parts of Africa underdeveloped.
And that imbalance, that's still with us today, right?
Oh, absolutely. The effects of colonialism and the slave trade, they're still visible in global trade and wealth distribution. You see it in the concentration of wealth in those former colonial powers and the challenges faced by developing nations.
And then there's the whole issue of racial inequality. It's impossible to ignore the deep-rooted racism that was used to justify slavery. And that racism, it still plagues societies all over the world.
That's right. That idea of racial superiority used to dehumanize Africans, it's left scars that run deep. We see it in systemic discrimination, racial profiling, the way poverty and violence disproportionately impact communities of color.
So it's not just about something that happened in the past. It's about an ongoing struggle for social justice, for equality, something we're still grappling with today.
Exactly. And that's why understanding this history is so important. To acknowledge these deep roots, to actively work to dismantle systems that keep inequality alive.
Wow, this deep dive has been, well, it's been a real eye-opener. I mean, reading about the slave trade in a textbook, it's one thing, but connecting it to a specific ship, a ship named the Jesus of Lübeck, it makes it so much more real and so much more disturbing.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just a bunch of facts in a book. It's a living story that shapes our present and our future.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from the story of the Jesus of Lübeck?
I think it challenges us to face some uncomfortable truths about our past. to look closely at the systems, the structures that keep inequality alive, and to remember that we all have a responsibility to learn from history and work towards a future where, well, where these kinds of atrocities never happen again.
It's a call to action, isn't it? To be aware, to be engaged, to fight for justice and equality in every way we can.
Absolutely. We all have a part to play in building a more just and equitable world.
Well said. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been incredibly insightful, to say the least. And everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this exploration of history and how it connects to our world today, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel for more fascinating deep dives. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.